There's a lot of research evidence which shows that how media reports suicide can actually influence suicide rates. Okay, so bad reporting by the media can actually increase suicides, whereas good reporting by the media can reduce or help towards reducing suicide rates. So in fact, it's one of the 6 things that WHO says there is good evidence for if you are doing suicide prevention, and one of the 6 things is media reporting and addressing that. It's because it has an actual practical impact on people's lives.
By talking about the problem with staying committed, that was a huge point of discussion yesterday as well.
So there are a whole host of things. Committed is one thing. The committed word is something that even AP, the Associated Press, in their guidelines say that they don't use that because it somehow implies something to do with criminality or to do with intent of some sort, or mainly criminal intent. And so that's one of the reasons why they say don't use it, when there are other better words that can be used. If people are doing suicide stories, I think it's also important to use people first language, and not use terms which do not denote agency. So, I see a lot of times people using terms like suffers depression or mentally ill person. I don't think we want to say mentally ill person or the mentally ill. What we need to be saying is persons living with mental illness, or persons living with depression, or persons living with schizophrenia. We do that with other conditions also, like diabetes. Now, we don't call people diabetics. It also adds to the stigma. And when mental health problems and suicide already have so much stigma, then that just makes the stigma worse. There's also a lot of the guidelines also talk about the language to use. Don't make it sensationalist. Don't put it on the front page headlines. Try and keep it inside. And it's not that complicated. It's not something that requires rocket science to understand. The problem is with not saying committed. The problem is not to sensationalize it, not to have headlines which are screaming headlines about somebody's suicide. You probably don't want to include and say suicide in the big bold headlines. You can obviously have it in your story. And if you're going to talk about suicide, it makes no sense to just get into the gory details of everything. What you want to do is to use that occasion to educate people and to highlight what is missing, or to make a point to the policymakers on what they want to do. So while you do want to talk about the story, and that can be a useful starting point to write an article about suicide. 2 things that editors need to do is obviously educate their journalists, definitely, but also move suicide reporting from crime reporters to health reporters. To actually include some helpline numbers in their reports. Why do we say do that? Is because we know from research that sometimes reading or hearing about suicide can trigger those thoughts in somebody who's vulnerable. So if it triggers them, then at least there's some help which is available, and also in general it helps to spread news about where help is available for suicide. Some of the reporting guidelines do say that, look, don't identify the method, don't emphasize where it happened, the location, the place, because I know many journalists kind of think that this is trying to restrict them in some sort of way. It's not restricting them as much as getting them to realize that their reporting can have an impact on somebody's lives.
I've read about this concept called suicide contagion, where reading about it triggers you, and it does lead to copycat suicides.
That's right.
Something that
especially with celebrity suicide. So you really need to be very careful when you're reporting that, and is particularly with young celebrity suicides.
One of the myths that we need to push back against is that suicide is preventable. we need to, hammer in the point that suicide is preventable. Do you think we should be doing that in every article where we talk about suicide in some way as journalists?
I think so, because I think there are two reasons for it. One is, I think it generates hope. So if somebody is reading your article and if the tone of the article is that it can be prevented, then that generates hope. Secondly, I think we need to, as a society, get out of this fatalistic attitude towards suicide, and say that, look, if we made enough efforts at a policy level in terms of our services, in terms of how we talk about it, in terms of how we spread the news about it, then we can prevent suicides.
Often the pictures accompanying the text are also very graphic and very insensitive. Are there any guidelines on these?
Well, there are a lot of guidelines on that too, about imagery and which images to use, which images not to use. For example, if you have a suicide note, then don't publish the suicide note. In India, a lot of newspaper reporting, you'll see a story on suicide will have a stock photograph of a noose or somebody jumping off from somewhere. Now, clearly, these are not good imageries to use. And you need to avoid that, because one is they're crass in many ways, but also they could trigger people. You don't want to be discussing methods of suicide, particularly because in India, about 40% of suicides happen with hanging. So, if you're going to put a picture of a noose up there, then you're actually, you're making it worse. You're trying to kind of almost suggest the methods that people might want to use.
Even when we're talking about the person, to talk about his life and his achievements,
exactly,
or something like that, rather than,
you need to focus on the life of the person rather than the death of the person. And I think the emphasis should not be on the death as much, or the manner of the death or the mode of the death, but actually focus on their life. Like, for example, if somebody had to die of a heart attack, you don't focus your whole story on the heart attack, isn't it? You focus your story on their life, what they were doing. I mean, there'll probably be a one-line mention of the fact that, they were ailing and they had a heart problem or something like that. And that's not made into a big issue. So similarly, we need to do the same with mental health and also with suicides.
On the link between, suicide and depression, that's something that a lot of journalists sort of just went with, where we assumed that the person who died had some sort of mental illness, and that that resulted in their death, that had a direct role. But, there's lots to say that obviously not all depressed people kill themselves.
That's right.
And there has to be...
I think that is a problem for two reasons. One is, a lot of this data of the link between depression and suicide usually has come from Western countries, where nearly 80% of people who die by suicide will have a depressive illness. And so clearly depression is the big thing if you are considering or working in a Western country. The problem is, in India, that's not true. In India, research shows that roughly around 50% of people may have a mental health problem, but the other 50% don't have a mental health problem. So you can't be making an excuse all the time that, it's all mental illness kind of a thing. And there are many suicides that happen without mental illness. So I think that's an important thing. The second important thing to remember is that not everyone with mental illness dies of suicide. Okay, even in depression, about 1 to 2 out of 10 people will die of suicide. Okay, the remaining 8 don't.